have to be able to tangibly explore and be able to explain in ways that people would be able to grasp. Science has to be based on the results of controlled experimentation and observation. So when we develop theories, they have to be based on that rigorous scientific method. The results of our scientific investigations have to be repeatable and verifiable. That means that if somebody else does the experiment in the same way that you did it, they should get the same or very similar results. That's what it means to be verifiable. Also, science must be refutable. If a hypothesis is not supported by evidence, it must be rejected or reworded. And we would start over with the scientific method. Now, some examples of how those first four characteristics come into play here, right? We talked about in order for a valid scientific theory, or for a scientific theory to be valid, there has to be some way that an observation or experiment could prove it to be false. So I'm going to give you an example here. Einstein's theory of relativity makes predictions about the results of experiments. These experiments could have produced results that contradicted Einstein, right? So we say that that experiment, or that theory rather, is falsifiable. We could in fact, if we found that there were experiments that did not correspond to the theory, that we would reject it out of hand. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit here about the idea that it has to be investigated. Characteristics of science is that the natural world has to be investigated and explained in terms that we can understand. Let's say somebody comes up with a theory that the moon is populated by little green men who can read our minds, and they're going to hide anytime anyone on Earth looks for them. They're going to flee into a deep space or hide anytime a spacecraft comes near. Right? I mean, that's an explanation for what we observe in nature, right? We've never observed little green people living out in space. But the reason that this is not scientific is, I mean, it's not falsifiable. There's no way for us to actually see these little green men. These green men are designed so that no one could ever see them. So that kind of gets to the idea of what a scientific theory can and cannot do. And then I'm going to wrap up with the last characteristic of science, which is, I think, really important for us to understand as we go through this year. Science is not a faith-based way to understand the world. One doesn't have to believe in science, right? It's not a matter of believing in the germ theory, or believing in the cell theory, or believing in the law of gravity, or believing in the theory of evolution. Rather, one comes to new understandings by first-hand experience. When you do experiments, when you make observations, when you draw inferences from available data, you can see how all the pieces fit together to make an explanation. And those explanations, again, have to be based on these previous four characteristics, that we can, in fact, investigate and understand the world around us. That it's based on evidence, controlled experimentation, observation. That we should be able to repeat what we've discovered, and that we should be able to refute it if contradictory data is ever found. Okay, I think it's important to keep in mind that, right, there's nothing wrong with religious belief. For instance, like creationism. You watch the video with Bill Nye where he describes creationism as a way of thinking. But keep in mind that things like creationism are not considered scientific theories because they do not meet the criteria of what science is, right? They do not meet the characteristics of science. Creationism, for instance, tells us what happened, but it doesn't explain how, when, or why, or through what mechanisms. It cannot be proven false, right? Because you cannot disprove the existence of a divine creator. And the last reason why it's not considered a scientific theory is the nature of creationism means that the primary tenet, which is divine creation, can never be changed, much for the same reason you can't disprove it. So it's very important for you to understand the distinction between science as a way of knowing, which is based on empirical observation and evidence, and other ways of knowing. For instance, understanding and having faith. Okay, so that is our look at science. We'll be doing some investigating in class. We'll kind of practice with the setup of an experiment and draw some conclusions. And as we move forward through the year, we're going to apply what we've learned in these first two screencasts. So until we see you next time in class, signing off, this is Mr. Gales. We'll talk to you later.